Chris with Cowdog here. Let's make a Japanese style tool chest. As I've gotten into accumulating more hand tools over the years, my table saw wing has become the flat surface that ultimately houses all my clutter. You can see over my left shoulder there that all my chisels, Japanese planes, blades, even a glue bottle just collect there. And with some of those tools being rather expensive, it didn't make sense anymore to just leave them out to be knocked over. So I've been reading Odate's book on Japanese woodworking tools and felt that a box to house them and also take with me on the road when I needed to was the most ideal solution. I was also heavily inspired by Schwartz's anarchist tool chest. However, my execution and lack of planning ultimately derailed me from making the perfect tool chest for my particular workflow. The carcass for this tool chest was constructed from 5/8 yellow pine, all construction grade stuff. I've had these boards sitting around for a while on my porch, probably almost a year, so they're super duper dry. They're actually milled from 2x12s as well, and for the most part I was able to cherry pick some pretty clear sections of board. I went with yellow pine because I wanted to make this box extremely approachable for those who decided to try to recreate it, and I thought it was a nice touch to have it match my Nicholson workbench, which is also constructed from yellow pine as well, as an ode to Japanese craftsmen who would make their own toolboxes from construction grade materials that they used. The short sides of the box are going to be dadoed into the long sides at an 1/8 inch depth, so using the width of the panel plus the diameter of a 1/4 inch drill bit, I can set up a stop to nail the exact length of those short sides, since half of a 1/4 inch will leave me with an 1/8 inch on either side. With all the components cut, 4 sides for the box, lid, and what was supposed to be eventually the bottom, I can start trying to figure out how long I want this to actually be. Things got a little muddy here as I started measuring it off of my pole saw, which is the longest tool for the chest. I'll talk about that a little more in depth at the end of the video, but in reality there's no harm in oversizing your carcass assuming you have the available material. It's always better from a storage perspective to have a little more room to play with as opposed to figuring out how you're going to be squeezing stuff in after it's built. This video is brought to you in part by the Home Depot Prospective, and if you've been watching some of my more recent videos, it's pretty evident that I've been linked up with Diablo tools this year. It's been a while since I've had a quality dado stack in the shop, and this 8-inch dado stack definitely surpassed my expectations, not only in cut quality, but accuracy and setup. It cuts, it rips, it slices and dices, it comes with blades, chippers, shims, and a carrying case for easy storage. Also, as an aside, while this is a new stack, the blades are resharpenable. So if you've got a guy in town that can tune up your carbides, you are in luck. I'll have this linked in the first comment and the description below. So a viewer by the name of Sean Murphy commented on my sawhorse video that the Japanese name of this technique for compressing wood fibers to then re-expand them in the joint is called kigoroshi. If you had missed that one, I'll have it up in the corner, but the nuts and bolts of it is that the mortise, in this case the dado, is cut just a hair small of the tenon, in this case the panel. Then the end of the panel is peened to fit into the dado. Once the glue makes contact, the water content will allow the crushed fibers to rehydrate for a perfect fit. Now this may not be the joinery you come to my channel to see, but bear with me here. I'm marking, pre-drilling, and eventually bringing everything together with screws. Yes, you heard me correctly, and your eyes are not deceiving you. They're just 1¼ star drive screws, but no need to fret, no screws were ultimately harmed in the making of this video, as once the glue is fully cured, the screws will be replaced with Miller dowels. That's a technique borrowed from Christopher Schwartz that I learned in making my Nicholson bench, and it stays true to some of the doweled construction in Japanese tool chests that I've seen. Also, it obviates the needs for clamps, as the mechanical nature of the screws will tighten everything together while the glue dries. This is where things really started unraveling on this build. I had hopes of making a shiplapped bottom panel, also out of yellow pine. Typically I over measure everything when I rough cut so that I have plenty of room for error in shoring things up to final dimension. However, I must have been a little low blood sugar before lunch or something along those lines, because I ended up cutting it not to the full length of the box, but to the outside of the dado. And then the other board I ended up somehow to the inside of the dado. Needless to say, I was not particularly pleased. There was work to be done before heading back to Home Depot for a lumber run, so I decided to work on the end caps, lid, and the closure mechanism for the box. I've never really used a separate crosscut blade for crosscuts, mostly because I find it annoying to constantly change out a blade from a general purpose to a singular purpose. However, this fine finish crosscut blade from Diablo definitely has me rethinking my general laziness. The high tooth count creates an incredibly smooth, I'd say probably equivalent of 220 grit finish on end grain with absolutely no burning. And in case you're wondering, yes, I left it in to do some rip cuts from time to time, and it was slower but totally fine nonetheless. This was another point where I got caught in my own head trying to make this box a little more approachable for an everyday builder. The closure mechanism for Japanese tool chests consists of a wedged and compound angle block on one end. Ideally, the cap, wedge, and the resistance piece are all cut from the same block and then mounted. Cap goes onto the box, the resistance piece goes onto the lid, and the corresponding angled wedge is free, which pushes under the cap piece on the other end. I know, it's all a little bit confusing. In my mind, I thought it would be easier to use a dual wedge system coming from either end so as to take the accuracy component out, because the wedges from either end would fill the void and lock everything into place. As it turns out, after I did it, I hated the idea. It looked stupid. I kept thinking about how annoying it would be to have two pieces rattling around, and it just never sat quite right. I was already low on this dried yellow pine anyway, so as a replacement, I used what I had left, just an extra piece I had cut, to cut the middle wedge and then planed it to fit. In reality, this piece should be about an inch or two longer and then flush trim to the box. However, I'm just going to call it rustic and keep it moving. The branding just helps me know which end of the wedge goes where. I want to use the surface of this as another I guess in-field sharpening station, if you will. So I'm going to use my largest stone to kind of measure out the layout here. I'll angle this just so we can get a better look. Now, I have this cross support, which I'll probably put right around here, and then I'll be able to use a dual wedge system from either side to be able to secure the stone and my other shorter stones as well, and have an actual sharpening station literally on the lid of my toolbox, which should be kind of cool. Now, I picked up some white pine and plenty of it to do the shiplap to bottom, and therefore I am back on the dado stack again. Instead of doing what I did last time where I cut the grooves flat on the table saw surface, I'm going to use a high fence and run them vertically. That'll delineate my middle piece, and then I can cut the two pieces that will sit on the long sides to final width later. Now, wood movement is real, I promise, so instead of having the boards butt together tightly, they're spaced about 1/8 of an inch apart to account for some expansion and contraction. See, I was not lying about that crosscut blade. Not going to get overly crazy with the glue here, and the idea is that I'm only going to glue on the long grain so that I'm not overly restricting the wood laterally, and just like the rest of the box, after the glue dries, the screws will be replaced with Miller dowels. Now the middle shiplapped panel actually doesn't get glued at all. That will just be set with Miller dowels, which of course will have a little glue on them inevitably to mount them into their pre-drilled holes. These little pine offcuts are getting a 45-degree bevel on one side and will ultimately be the handles for the box that are mounted to the bottom of the end caps and the short sides of the box. This is the start of a lot of CA glue action in this video, so consider yourself forewarned. The CA glue just operates as a quick holding operation while the yellow glue fully dries. In most applications, it obviates the need for clamping pressure or mechanical fasteners. And I'm doing it again here as I glue in these runners, of which my tool trays in the box itself will ride on. The runners are going on the long side of the box, which at the end of the video I'll explain why that's not the most ideal. However, I'm starting with the thickest stock runners at the bottom and then using a slightly thinner grade above that. That will give me 3 tiers, a floor on the bottom of the box, a level above that, and one more above that for tool placement. So I cannot seem to stop messing this box up. Off camera, I was actually gluing on one of the other runners and I stopped to refill my glue bottle and forgot to put the cap on and then spilled glue all over the inside of this box. Luckily, most of it cleaned up with water and the rest of it I was actually able to use. There are a couple things to note. Practically speaking here, one of the problems that I have is that my sashigane is literally 5 millimeters too long for the box in this direction. So I sort of have this idea where I'm going to be able to try to mount it to the inside of the lid using magnets. It is barely going to fit. There's little margin for error. I'm just dealing with a ton of errors and mistakes, and the layout as to how all the tools are going to fit in is going to be a little bit tricky as well. So right now what it's looking like is that my larger slicks and saws and plane bodies and probably my sharpening supplies, I haven't quite figured that out yet, are all going to be on this first floor. This second level here, which is a little bit thinner, is going to be my measuring tools as well as my hammers. And then I believe the final bit up here is going to be primarily chisels, and everything will be removable except for obviously this bottom level here. I'm a little undecided on whether or not I'm going to have, say, a deep tray on this side. Essentially, I need to be able to have at least a little bit of lateral movement so that way I can remove things to be able to have access to the bottom here. Everywhere there were screw holes, I'm going to be installing Miller dowels, and so I'm just going to use the previously screwed hole as my pilot hole, pre-drill, and then tap these suckers in with some glue. If you've got a sharp eye, you'll see glue just tearing out of my short panel there. And yes, that'll be a problem later. Nothing fatal, but definitely not ideal. In an effort to further figure out my tool layout, I've outlined the bottom dimensions of the box in blue tape on my workbench, and I'm just trying to see how things actually sit. I'm sure there's a better way to do this, but that probably takes a little more thoughtfulness than just fiddling around on the fly. Maybe next time, I suppose. However, this does afford me the opportunity to get some pretty decent measurements for installing these dividers on the bottom floor of the box. This little piece here is for holding the blades for my Kataba and Ryoba. I'm just going to use a little pressure to mark where the blade naturally rests and then cut the relief into it after. And here's my bit of fun with magnets. The blue tape will just outline the width of the blade of the Sashigane, and then I'll mark center between the tape lines, punch, drill, and set the magnets in with CA glue. Now that I'm rewatching this build during the edit, I may go back and drill more magnets for other small rules in my mini Japanese square. Those require little to no accuracy at all, in fact, and based on how well this is holding up, should work out great to free up some tray space in the future. This is a trick I learned from my buddy Jeff over at Two Moose Designs. Using a couple scrap sticks that are shorter than your opening, you can spread them out end to end to make sure you're nailing interior measurements. Pretty nifty. I can then take this to measure on my table saw to make sure I'm getting the perfect tray width. I apologize again for my lack of complex joinery here, but the trays are going to be brought together with rabbets and have a groove cut through to house the bottom. The bottoms are just thin panels I glued up off camera with some scraps I had laying around. My audible discontent is another product of my lack of thoughtfulness in measuring. Since the groove is set to depth of my rabbet, the side panels of the tray should be the exact length of the panel. For whatever reason I overcomplicated that and the panel ended up too long. I didn't discover that piece of rocket science till after I put this one together, which yes I did ultimately get correct. And these little brass twist nails are just tapped in to hold everything together while the glue dries. The chisel tray needs something to secure the handles, so I whipped up this little series of semicircles and some pine on the drill press before doing the CA glue and yellow glue deal to secure it into the tray itself. And to protect my precious edges, I'm beveling a couple pieces to fit on the opposing side of the tray to keep the chisels from banging into each other and keep my nice sharp edges nick-free. If you saw my monster mallet video, Crubber, aka Cork Rubber, made its debut there. I'm going to line most of the tool trays with it to keep things from rattling around too much when the box is getting moved, as well as the sharpening station area on the top of the lid. The Crubber is affixed with contact cement, which I should add you should definitely use in a better ventilated area than a small one-car garage. Definitely roasted a few precious brain cells doing otherwise. I'm leaving this box without a penetrating or film finish, but I do want to use some clear carnauba wax to help the trays glide laterally inside the box. This stuff is an all-natural hardening paste wax, and it's a great alternative to chemically stank paste waxes.
Now the toolbox here is finished. I did want to show off this little feature. I had discussed it earlier during the build, essentially of creating a small sharpening station right here on the lid of the box. Now, when I'm in the field, I don't necessarily have to do a full-blown sharpen. It's usually just something as a tune-up, but I wanted to have essentially a stone holder right here on my surface, and I'll just demonstrate how that works. I cut just off camera a couple wedges, some fluffies there, and this wedge system here is really designed to hold both a diamond stone and my Shapton glass back. Now the way that this works is that these two wedges will lock into place, so I'll just take these, set them in, keep everything down. As you can see, very solid. For a diamond stone, very similar concept, except the wedge is going to be a little more spread out. Again, keeping everything pretty flat and down. Voila. And then same thing, to remove it, pop it out.
And that's all she wrote for this one. Listen, this box was not without its challenges, but I've got a place to keep my tools out of the way in the shop and a fairly tidy way to transport them from place to place if needed. I certainly learned a fair bit on the do's and don'ts of tool chest building and organization, and I'm pretty curious to actually get more use out of this sucker in the day-to-day and just see how it works into my workflow. Now, on to a little more of an in-depth discussion on the issues.
I did want to spend a minute just going over some of the problems and the flaws that I encountered when I was building this toolbox. A couple different things here. Number one, the box itself probably should have been at least another 4 or 5 inches longer. One of the problems that created was the orientation of the trays. So essentially, instead of having trays that slide in this direction, you want trays that slide in this direction. And the reason for that being is that you want to be able to have access to all your tools without having to remove all your trays. Now, for me, there are some advantages here. I have now an actual chisel caddy, which I can take out and set on my bench or set in the workspace wherever I'm at. However, if I want to get to a saw or a hammer or even my dies, I have to take everything out of the box in order to access it. So that is an issue in and of itself. Now, also as far as organization, I didn't plan things out overly well, so I ended up with this drawer right here, which holds my Sumitsubo, my marking gauge, and basically a bunch of odds and ends. So this has now kind of become my junk drawer in a way. It's a little bit deeper than my other trays, and it just sort of operates as a catch-all. Earlier in the video, you probably heard me saying something about how this tray was supposed to hold all my measuring tools. Unfortunately, as you can see, that didn't really work out. It does seem to hold essentially my sharpening equipment pretty perfectly. There are a lot of my flat laying measuring tools. I had to kind of take my small 10-foot tape, stick it over here. My 16-foot tape is over here. And then as we noted earlier, my Sashigane is magnetically mounted to the lid. Now, let's talk about the lid itself, because as I had demonstrated earlier in the video, that was not without its problems too. So the biggest issue here is that the lid, as it sets here, the lid is always supposed to be under this cap piece here. So as I had cut it about a little over a centimeter shy on one side and probably closer to an inch on the other, and yes, it is square across, the issue that it creates is that this corner is raising up. And that could be from a number of different reasons, but had it been actually under this cap block at all times, it would actually settle a little bit better. Now, another thing to note too is that this is a very soft wood. It does seem to expand and contract pretty rapidly here in my shop just on the different humidity changes. The fit on this is starting to get a little bit loose already. It's getting a lot less resistance, and as you can see, it still comes up on that side. Now, the design of it is nice because ultimately it's not going to come out. It could fall out from, one side or the other. However, as far as whether or not this is going to lift out, I'm not really super concerned about that. And a couple more issues to check out over here. Now, this box was actually inspired by Barbie Woodshop on Instagram, who made a very small version of this box. One of the features of that toolbox that they had showed to me was this shiplap style bottom. Now, the middle board here is actually supposed to be flipped, so that way the sort of half lap that is here that allows for wood movement laterally is actually going to have this piece on the bottom. Now, practically speaking, everything is mounted in with Miller dowels. There also is some glue on the side pieces as well as just in this zone here in the middle. I'm not overly concerned with it. If it doesn't still hold, eventually y'all will be the first to know about it. Another fun fact too is that I probably should have used a little bit of thicker stock for my side pieces and really for the entire carcass in general. You can actually see up here where one of my Miller dowels had just blown right through the side. That was an annoying fix that I had to do off camera. And I really say it's not much of a fix at all because essentially all I did was scrape and sand that to be flush with the rest of my carcass. There were some other spots where I did notice a little bit of bulging from the Miller dowel coming in. Again, had I used thicker stock, that would have solved that problem. So the moral of the story on this build is that proper planning is just as important as execution. So while this will hold my tools, as I said earlier, it's not the most functional situation. There is a lot of kind of workflow annoyance. Again, I have to take all my trays out to be able to access it. But with that being said, on a job site, at the very least, or even here in the shop, it keeps my tools in these trays, and then there is a nice, neat way to pack them away. It's also gonna be good for travel as well. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time here at Cowdog Craftworks.